Hello and welcome into the GSMC Sports Podcast brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host TJ Mabarty. Happy Friday. We are coming to you live on August 2nd. And today we are going to be going all NFL with the show. Last night was the Hall of Fame game, marking, yes, just a preseason game, but the first official game for 2024-25. And it is just so exciting to finally be getting back into this. Love my other sports as well, but football, of course, is king in America, so really looking forward to that. It was just a preseason game, but we did see a couple interesting things, notably the introduction of the new kickoff rule, and we'll be breaking down sort of what my thoughts were and first impressions on that, as we probably have some long ways to go in terms of working our way into that strategy. Got a couple starters from the Texans last night that could be somewhat worthy-ish to talk about. And then additionally, I thought ESPN did a great job with their broadcast team, so I want to touch on that. But then we're going to be moving across the league and just talking about some of the latest storylines. Justin Herbert, the Chargers quarterback, is now being sidelined with a right foot injury that's expected to keep him out for a lot of the rest of training camp, so we'll be touching on that. Additionally, Patriots rookie quarterback Drake May has been facing a lot of criticism after the first week or so of camp has not been going his way, and a lot of people, especially given that this time in football we are latching on to everything we possibly can, and it hasn't been sounding good for Drake May. So I want to discuss whether or not the criticism there is fair, and then we are going to be diving into the upcoming season for the Las Vegas Raiders as we continue our season previews for every team. And then we'll just be sending you off with a pretty lighthearted final segment of the week as the excitement for the NFL continues to build. I will be giving a list of some of my biggest things that I'm looking forward to this upcoming season. But before we get into all of that, just a reminder to like, follow, subscribe wherever you keep up with us. To any of our viewers, be sure to use the comment section to give us your thoughts on the latest happenings in sports as we try and make this show as interactive as possible. And if you would consider leaving a tip or donation, you can use the link that is streaming across the bottom ticker, gsmcpodcast.net. Whether it's leaving a comment there or just in our general chat, we love to have contributions from our viewers. But diving into last night's Hall of Fame game, yes, of course, it is just a preseason game, but it signifies something so much bigger than that, considering that we are now going to have football to watch every Thursday from now through December 26th, I think, is the last Thursday night football game. So we are big time back. And I do just want to sort of touch on what ended up being a very interesting night for a couple different reasons. For starters, we of course had the introduction of the new kickoff format. That was one of the biggest changes, I think, to the actual rule book that I have ever seen. And last night we got to see what it looked like on an NFL field. Now, we've seen similar iterations of this across other types of football leagues, but this is going to take a little bit of adjusting in the NFL. Ultimately, I don't think that the results ended up being all that much different. And we saw the NFL, they were contemplating the idea of taking kickoffs out of the game altogether, because it just sort of turned into, especially by the end last year, just a nothing play that there was really no purpose to it anymore at that point. And I do honestly think that this could be sort of a fun rule to work into it. Now, I don't even know what the general consensus on this is, so maybe I'm on an island here. But I think for starters, the fact that you can 100% see how much safer it is for a lot of these players, that it, after I played high school football, so nowhere near the same level of athletes you're going up against, but it results in some big time stingers, the way that you have these, again, grown men, top tier athletes sprinting straight towards you, and the whole running back and flipping and trying to lay the block. I can 100% see why that is a health concern, and it's it's an interesting wrinkle here that maybe it works, maybe it doesn't. I feel like I heard Troy Aikman say that the NFL isn't committed to it entirely long term, that they may be willing to adjust after this year, but I was kind of cool with it. As much as I did talk about player safety, as I was sort of writing down in my notes about that, I did end up watching Tyler Scott get smoked, the return man for the Bears, at the beginning of that second quarter after the Texans' field goal drive. He ended up just getting absolutely laid out, but that's besides the point. So still get your hard collisions there for all of you, old-time traditional NFL fans. So I think it'll be interesting for sure to see how that progresses. But, there weren't many starters out for either one of these teams. The Bears announced that across the board, they were not going to be starting any of their number ones. The Texans, we got to see a couple players that I was particularly interested in, actually, where they had a couple of their younger starting offensive linemen in Juice Scruggs and Kenyon Green, both for picks in the first 2 days of their past couple drafts, and I think that they ultimately looked pretty good. And the time that they did play for, they were in on the first 2 drives. The Texans were able to score on both of those, got some really good push from the offensive line. So these are 2 players for the Texans that would really be nice to see them develop, as they are going to try and be looking to add more to that run game over the past couple years that hasn't been all that successful. But now you're looking at an offense with CJ Stroud. You feel like you have that pass game, and you could become a really elite, all-around, well-rounded team. But that offensive line is going to have to take a step forward this year. You have some of the more reliable veterans that got the night off. Of course, most notably is Laramie Tunsil at the left tackle position. But again, you still look across the board, they're pretty average. I'd say Shaq Mason, though, is, a former Pro Bowler, I believe, and, it's going to be up front in the middle of that offensive line. Having Green and Scruggs get the reps last night, it was something that I at least was looking for. Obviously, it's not everybody's, go-to scouting report when you come away from this game, but I also liked watching Cade Stover, the tight end out of Ohio State that the Texans drafted this past year, and I really liked Cade Stover in college, and I thought that he ultimately had a pretty good game for himself, where he was involved on a few run plays. There was one broken play where Cade Stover wasn't able to get to the other edge and set the block on the other end, ended up getting his quarterback at that point, lit up a little bit. But I do think that Stover ultimately looked pretty good in this game. And, the other wacky part of this game that I can't believe I haven't even mentioned yet was the fact that, of course, it was dismissed during the third quarter due to weather delays. So that was definitely a little wrinkle that was thrown into the mix there. But, at the same time, it's the Hall of Fame game of all preseason games. I was excited to just watch football, obviously, and I tried to pick up, again, with Scruggs and Kenyon Green, with Cade Stover, tried to pick up on as much as I could of things that could end up impacting the regular season, but ultimately, that's not usually what you're expecting to get out of preseason games. For whatever it's worth, the Bears are headed into a season with a new offensive coordinator, considering the fact that the past few years with Justin Fields just flat out did not work. So, ahead of this season, they decided to fire Luke Getsy, who was with the team for 2 seasons. They bring in Shane Waldron, and the Bears offense looked pretty good. Now, again, who knows how much stock you can actually put into it, but I've talked about the depth of their running back group, that I am fans of Roschon Johnson and Khalil Herbert. We got to see both of them in action last night. I think between the two of them, a combined 10 carries, so not anything crazy, but at least sort of cool to see there. And then ultimately it became the Brett Ripien and Colin Johnson show, where they hooked up for a few big time catches. Colin Johnson able to bring in 2 touchdowns, had a couple impressive passes. So, for whatever it's worth, the very first look at Shane Waldron in Chicago looked pretty good. We'll have to obviously see it continue to happen with actual starters in the game, but just again, something that I thought was noteworthy there, considering there was a changing in that department during the offseason. I did have a couple of those, I forgot that they signed there this offseason players. Cam Akers making his return to the NFL. Obviously, a tough situation for Akers, considering the fact that he has been so injury plagued throughout his young career so far. And, I think it's 2 torn, it's Achilles or ACLs that have gotten in the way of him. But I had forgotten that he signed with the Texans. He ended up scoring a touchdown, I believe, on a reception. So it was cool to see there. Also forgot Jonathan Owens signed with the Bears. So just, those moments always tend to happen when you're first getting back into the NFL season. But the last thing I sort of want to highlight with this game is I was actually very impressed with the overall production of what ESPN was able to put out last night. Watching the pregame show, it was Scott Van Pelt, Ryan Clark, Jason Kelsey, and Marcus Spears. And frankly, with ESPN, it seems like at times they sort of lean more so into the narrative and entertainment stuff as opposed to giving quite as much insight into the actual sports at times. Not going to name names here, but last night I thought they did an incredible job with everything, where Scott Van Pelt, he was really hosting the overall, studio show. They were sort of in and out with the rest of the players. Marcus Spears and Jason Kelsey, I thought that they were both tremendous. Ryan Clark as well during the halftime show when he was in with just Kelsey and SVP. That went really well. They did another segment as well with just Adam Schefter giving some news updates. So it kind of felt like a Scott Van Pelt NFL Live type of show, but actually inserted into a game situation. And frankly, I just feel like that's not something that we see happen all too much with a lot of these networks, where it's actual drawn out thoughts as opposed to a bunch of former players, coaches, and whatever, personalities just jammed onto a desk to take turns of giving these little 30-second statements. That I thought the flow of it was incredible for ESPN last night. So I don't know what their overall plan is. They did, of course, just sign Jason Kelsey to a media deal following his retirement. Would love to see him involved in just that type of a vibe. I mean, let me know in the comments section what your thoughts were, because I thought that it was actually a very well run thing. And for whatever it's worth as well, TNT's Inside the NBA is coming to an end. That is everybody's favorite studio show, and it seems like, honestly, if they were to go that route of having Scott Van Pelt host the pregame, halftime, postgame show regularly when they do their Monday Night Football, and have that be a consistent thing, I would be fully on board for that. Now, maybe I'm putting way too much stock into this as somebody who is aspiring to be in sports media at some point, but something that I paid attention to, and honestly, I was really impressed with. So I'm going to be interested to see what they choose to do from here in regards of that studio show. But let me know what your overall thoughts on the game were. Again, sort of limited takeaways you can actually come away with, but definitely keeping an eye out for any types of starters or standout players throughout the preseason, because football's back, baby. So we're just getting excited about it. But on that note, we are going to be diving into one of the things that Adam Schefter actually touched upon during that halftime last night, and that was the Justin Herbert injury update, where he has something in his right foot that is going to be keeping him out for a handful of weeks now headed into the season. So we'll talk about what that is, what it looks like, and whether or not it is going to end up having an impact on the upcoming season for the LA Chargers. So we will dive into that, but first, a quick break. Do not go anywhere. We will be right back.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the face, yeah. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the news it fits, I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip, you choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast. Like we talked about, the NFL, maybe not officially for the regular season, but the NFL has now kicked off, so we are going to be continuing to dive into the latest headlines surrounding that. And something that has been a topic of conversation over the past couple days is the fact that Justin Herbert, the Los Angeles Chargers quarterback, is going to be missing a little bit of time here as he is dealing with an injury in his right foot. I'm not a doctor, so I don't know the exact medical analysis of it necessarily, but according to the Chargers Twitter account, the update on the injury is that doctors have recommended approximately 2 weeks in a boot, followed by a graduated return to play protocol, with the expectation that he is going to be ready for the regular season. So ultimately, not anything too devastating, but of course, especially coming off of last season and seeing what happened with Joe Burrow during that time where he was dealing with a calf injury throughout training camp, and it was very clear that it impacted him as the Bengals headed into the regular season, that he didn't have that same level of mobility, the throwing power off of that back leg. It was absolutely bothering him. So even though this isn't, a season anywhere close to a season-ending injury, there's a great chance he doesn't make any time. It's definitely a speed bump in the road, and it is disappointing. Now, Justin Herbert, I have more than enough confidence in him that he's going to be able to overcome it, but I do almost feel for him a little bit, because I feel like Herbert, from a national, reputation, I feel like he's been kind of hurt over these past couple years, considering the fact that he was almost lumped into the shortcomings of the Chargers, which is fair. He is the quarterback, and you can only make excuses for so long. But I thought that the Brandon Staley experiment in Los Angeles, when they brought him in to be their head coach for the past 3 seasons, was pretty disastrous. And as much as, Staley definitely does deserve a lot of the blame, I do also think that it goes beyond that as well. The past few seasons as well. I mean, Justin Herbert was the quarterback ultimately on the other side of that massive collapse in the wild card round versus the Jacksonville Jaguars, of course, in 2023. Joe Lombardi at the time. They've now seen changes in offensive coordinators in each of the past 2 seasons. Now it's Greg Roman, formerly with the Baltimore Ravens. So I think that ultimately what I'm getting at here is Justin Herbert, even though, yes, you can always say that he could have been more responsible in helping his team win games, at the end of the day, it's not a one-man show. And Justin Herbert is a potentially elite talent that I think is sort of scratching at that conversation, but hasn't fully been able to come into the limelight in that sense, where you look at, truthers maybe like myself looking at a lot of the fourth quarter stats, the fact that he has a number of comebacks in his resume already, so a number of game-winning drives, and that it seems like all of these Chargers games are always coming down to, late in the games, that he can only do so much. And you look at the receiver wide situation as well, where in the past, Quentin Johnston obviously took a lot of heat in his rookie season after sort of disappointing there, the big drops, and I believe it was the game against the Packers specifically, and that game was just an absolute disaster for everybody basically other than Justin Herbert. But I think that, still just 26 years old, Herbert has all of the tools that you could really ask for from a quarterback. The fact that he has the mobility, he can, and the athleticism to be able to get around. He's a big build, 6'6", and he has the arm strength as well to be able to make the right plays. And I think that he is going to eventually work himself into, the top end conversations, but it's going to take, I think, the Chargers maybe a little bit of time. I think it's going to ultimately come down to some degree at least, the Chargers having some more team success, which I don't know if that's necessarily going to be the case right away. And, we are going to be doing a full breakdown of the Chargers' upcoming season next Monday, so I don't want to dive into it too much necessarily now without doing the full prep for it. But I think that there's a really good chance that this could be sort of a 2-year process to build up under Jim Harbaugh once again. That I understand that he is a great coach, and his NFL track record, as well as his college track record, has been being a winner. I don't know if he ever had a losing season when he was with San Francisco about a decade ago, but there are still a lot of raw pieces ultimately on that Chargers offense. And Justin Herbert, again, there's just really only so much that he can do at this point in his career. And, there's this narrative floating around that he's a social media quarterback, as, some people would put it. And the fact that, he's coming off of a year where he was injured and the Chargers team as a whole was kind of a mess. It just feels like this is, a time where Justin Herbert seemed like he was skyrocketing into these top-end quarterback conversations, and he's being left behind a little bit with the emergence of other young stars such as Jordan Love and CJ Stroud, even though they're really not all that much younger than him anyways. So I think that it's unfair, but that is also just the typical discourse when it comes to, stars in the NFL or really in any of the majorly covered leagues. So Justin Herbert, you look at what's around him, I would say it's ultimately a lateral move going off of an older Austin Eckler to Gus Edwards and J.K. Dobbins, but you still don't feel great about that. There is a clear lack of a number one wide receiver at this point, where sure, you use high draft capital on Quentin Johnston, like I mentioned, and Ladd McConkey this past year's draft to try and, see if you can get anything to stick there. Joshua Palmer's a fine wide receiver. They bring in a veteran in DJ Chark. Like, I'm giving out names here, but ultimately, there's no guarantee really at that position group, I would say. And tight ends are fine, I suppose. They made some additions this offseason in Will Dissly and Hayden Hurst, but a lot of unproven on that offensive line as well. And I just don't know if he's going to have the pieces around him this season. And this is a Justin Herbert thing, but it's also just Jim Harbaugh. Like, if the Chargers don't end up having an unbelievable season this year, I think that there's no panic whatsoever. That, again, the Chargers were where they were with the 5th overall pick in this past year's draft for a reason. It's because they had a lot of holes last season, and not just that, but they had a lot of really bad contracts that they had to spend a lot of the offseason sort of tinkering with, and that's why you see the release of Mike Williams, the trade of Keenan Allen, that their financial situation was a little bit of a disaster. So the Chargers, I mean, ultimately, they have a pretty easy schedule, and that is going to be something to take into consideration. Sharp Football Analysis has them at 8.5 wins. So I'll leave it at that for now. Again, I'm going to do my actual in-depth look into the Chargers' upcoming season. That'll be coming out on Monday, so be sure to tune in for that. But ultimately, I think that Justin Herbert, in regards to this injury, again, it's nothing to panic about, but I also wouldn't be in a massive rush necessarily to make sure that Justin Herbert, and it sounds so lame, it's football. No one's ever going to sort of hold out, especially after the contract that Justin Herbert was already given. That's not necessarily, it's not needed, but at the same time, I guess it's more so my idea behind this particular injury and overall with Justin Herbert, that I think you got to have a little bit of patience to fully see the vision come through. And again, maybe Jim Harbaugh is able to sort of spark some magic in year one, but a lot of turnover both from a roster perspective and the coaching staff. So we'll be getting into all of those changes more in depth on Monday. So definitely be sure to tune into that. But another young quarterback that I think is already being set up for some criticism beyond need at this point is rookie quarterback Drake May, of course, taken 3rd overall by the Patriots. And we are now, I believe, a week, maybe less than that, into training camp. And already there are a number of national outlets that are speculating on if he is not going to be good enough, if he could end up losing his spot on the roster to Joe Milton, who they took out of Tennessee with the 6th overall pick. So I want to dive into that conversation and sort of give my thoughts on why we are really getting ahead of ourselves on that front. And we will be touching on that, but first, a quick break. Do not go anywhere. We will be right back.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube to catch one of your new favorite shows, like the GSMC College Football Podcast, Chip Shot Football Podcast, Hoops and Heels Women's Sports Podcast, GSMC Basketball Podcast, and so many more. Check it out for yourself. GSMC Sports Network, now available on YouTube absolutely free. Search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube right now.
Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast as we continue to talk about young quarterbacks that are under a lot of fire. Drake May of the New England Patriots has already been getting tossed into some conversations about, I don't know if I've heard the word bust yet, but it seems like a lot of, media members are circling towards that. Of course, growing up in Massachusetts here, I see a lot of the local beat reporters talking about just how surprised they are that Drake May is as far behind as he is than to Jacoby Brissett, and that some of the concerns that Bill Belichick had specifically in accordance to his footwork and such, that Drake May does look very raw at this point, and that it doesn't seem likely that he is even going to have a chance to win the starting job to start off the season. And I never expected Drake May, even if he was, if he was incredible, it was going to be impossible for the Patriots to sit him. But I always assumed that they were going to err a little bit more on the cautious side with Drake May anyways. And for whatever it's worth as well, I do think that Jacoby Brissett is a very solid backup quarterback. That I've made this argument before. I think that he has been the best quarterback on his roster for at least the past two seasons, where this past year we saw Washington actually had a slightly better chance when they started him as opposed to Sam Howell, at least in my opinion. And I don't mind Howell by any means, but some of the mistakes were definitely glaring with him. But the offense looked slightly more functional with Brissett behind center. And then in 2022, granted it was a season in which Deshaun Watson was returning from his suspension and hadn't played football in over a year and a half or so, that I wouldn't expect him to look all too sharp. But in that 2022 season, from what we saw, Jacoby Brissett gave the Browns a better chance to win football games. And he is not some, elite top-end quarterback by any means, but I think he can absolutely get the job done for you. And that's kind of what I assumed the expectation was going to be headed into this season for the Patriots, where they are, at the bottom of the barrel in terms of overall roster talent. And I think that, it makes sense that Jacoby Brissett is significantly more ready for this job than Drake May is. Jacoby Brissett, he's 31 years old. He's headed into his age 32 season. I am not surprised by any means that Drake May, someone who is 22 years old, something like that he is not extremely sharp coming out of the gates in training camp. He's 21 right now. He turns 22 in August. There is more than enough time for him to be able to round out into the draft prospect that everybody was sort of on board that Drake May was going to need some development before being able to fully shine as, a top-end player. Again, just 21 years old, and I'm not to call out by any means, because I do greatly respect Colin Cowherd as, for what he does, but I saw the clip that he was talking about yesterday, and the idea that, because the offensive line isn't good and the receivers aren't good and the running back depth isn't good, that Joe Milton is going to win the job over Drake May. Neither one of them are going to be the starter this season. It's going to be Jacoby Brissett, the one who has 8+ years of NFL experience at this point. 8 years, I think, exactly. So the idea that also, just because Joe Milton is taller and a little bit more of a baseline athlete, everybody knew Joe Milton was athletic at Tennessee. That was his whole thing of, watch this dude rip a ball 80 yards downfield on a dot. But the consistency with accuracy is just not there yet. And I, of course, have a lot of Patriots fans in my life that are starting to buy into the Joe Milton hype train, and I think it would be absolutely electric if Joe Milton does emerge as a starting caliber guy. But I think Joe Milton was a lock to be a preseason darling, a training camp darling, where he makes some really impressive throws, he shows off his arm talent, and starts to, get the buzz building up a little bit. But ultimately, I think that if you watched him at Tennessee, you saw that the consistency from him in terms of being able to actually have the accuracy to keep up with NFL talent, just don't think it's there. Now, again, rooting for him because he is such a fun player to watch, whether it's the Patriots or anyone else, that if you can put all of that athletic talent together, that I think that's a quarterback that anybody really would want to watch. But I think it's so unfair to, already start writing off a 21-year-old quarterback that hasn't even taken a snap in preseason yet. I think we're getting way too ahead of ourselves. And I sort of alluded to it earlier in the show when I think that we're just at this point where football is in the air. You can smell it right around the corner. And we just sort of latch on to every sort of report or storyline that we hear. Like these people that are making claims about Drake May, a lot of them haven't even actually gotten to see him practice yet. And even if it is bad, it's kind of like, who cares? I'm not ready to, I don't know, everybody's just always so ready to move off of, the new thing and write somebody off. Obviously, more times than not, you see it click sooner rather than later. But to just have some preseason reps that don't go your way, and not even preseason, just training camps internally not go your way for a quarterback that we knew was going to be a little bit of a project, I'm not sure why you're, really analyzing like this. You understood that's what the background was. How could you be surprised by what we're hearing so far? And again, I think part of it probably somewhat has to do with the fact that Jacoby Brissett doesn't really get all that much respect, I feel like, generally from the NFL. And I think he is going to be a bottom half of the league starter when he comes in, and he's going to have a very rough situation around him in New England. But I think he's fine. I think he's going to pretty obviously give you the best chance to win by just not making the rookie mistakes and young player mistakes, you could say, like we saw from Mac Jones and Bailey Zappi in New England last year. That he's just going to provide a little bit more of veteran leadership, and that under this new regime, you just sort of have to have a little bit of faith. And we've seen that with Houston last year. Obviously, the quarterback talent as a whole much higher in Houston, but I could also equate it a little bit to Vegas, where Antonio Pierce was able to just instill confidence in what they had, and they had really inconsistent quarterback play. I think Jacoby Brissett can give you a good enough job to be in competition as long as the defense is totally intact there in New England. And obviously it's been a little bit messy there in terms of the developments of their defense over the past week or so. Finding out about Christian Barmore being diagnosed with blood clots, potentially putting his season in jeopardy. The Matt Judon situation, even though it sounds like Judon and Gerard Mayo had a positive conversation and things are headed back towards the right direction, we'll have to see there. And that defense as a whole has the potential to be, I would say, a top 10 unit, but we're going to have to see them actually all available for them to, even begin that dialogue, really. But let me know what you think in the comments section, because ultimately, at the end of the day, if you didn't like Drake May coming into this year's draft, you're pointing at those reports and saying, see, I told you so. But I don't think that it necessarily proves anything either way. So to me, honestly, it should be a nothing story. It should be that Drake May is struggling and that's sort of it. I think people are just making it out to be a bigger thing than it should be. And also, maybe people were just anticipating Drake May to be the starter. I never thought that was going to be the case. But again, let me know in the comments section how you feel. But I did just mention Antonio Pierce and the Raiders. We're going to be diving into their upcoming season, where we continue on the previews for all 32 teams. Today we do have the Raiders, so we will be getting into that, whether or not you believe Antonio Pierce can emerge as a real, significant head coach moving forward, where things stand in terms of the quarterback battlefront, and more. So stick with us, and we will be right back after this quick break.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast as we move along here to talk about the upcoming season for the Raiders. And the Raiders are coming into this year, given the fact that they just promoted interim head coach Antonio Pierce last year, and things were really messy for the majority of the season under Josh McDaniels, but it was clear there was an immediate change of emotion in the room when they did bring in Antonio Pierce as the interim. And I think that, again, when you talk about what it takes sort of in the NFL just to be able to emerge onto the scene and outperform expectations, it starts with just having a common belief that it's possible. And Antonio Pierce was able to do so last year. Now, the issue for the Raiders is that they still weren't able to actually address the offense all that much, and specifically that quarterback position, where it seemed like they were hoping to be able to take one of the top quarterbacks in this past year's draft, but with 6 quarterbacks going in the top 12 picks and them sitting at number 13, that just was not possible. So they end up taking Brock Bowers instead, which can be a really impactful positional player, and I want to sort of dive into their weapons in a moment here, but it leaves them with Aiden O'Connell and Gardner Minshew as the 2 candidates for winning the starting quarterback job. Now, I would have to imagine that Gardner Minshew probably gives you a greater chance to win this season, but it sounds like the early thoughts are that Aiden O'Connell is currently winning the job in Vegas. They took him in the 4th round last year, so maybe you hope that you can find a little bit of a diamond in the rough there. Ultimately, though, I don't think that either one of them are going to give you, even call it top 20 quarterback play in the league, and I don't want to bury the Raiders just for that alone. It goes a lot more in. There's a lot more that goes into it than just the quarterback position. But frankly, I'm not a believer in that. Now, I think that Antonio Pierce can sort of will them to some wins, and I don't think that their roster is necessarily, miles behind some of the other playoff contention teams, but they're going through a number of different changes this offseason. Notably, they lost Josh Jacobs in the offseason. Now, Zamir White seems like a prime candidate to have a breakout season and take over the starting role there and do so while flourishing. I understand the Raiders not necessarily wanting to pay money at that position, but I do think that it's a downgrade. Now, that's more of a statement, in my opinion, on Josh Jacobs, who I am definitely a fan of. But, Zamir White, Alexander Madison, Amir Abdullah, that's what you're looking at from a running back core. I don't think it's all that deep, and I think that it's definitely a downgrade from Josh Jacobs. Now, you look at their stats from last season, very pedestrian overall, where, like I just mentioned, you already weren't a good run team last year, 30th in the NFL, but for whatever it's worth as well, I do think that that is at least somewhat predicated on the fact that the pass game just wasn't really all that much of a threat. And you do look at now the situation, you would at least have, if it is O'Connell, that he is more experienced. He really struggled with turnovers in his rookie season. As long as he can just sort of limit the damage there, that maybe this turns into an offense that can have some threats. If you get yourself a Zamir White breakout season, you already have Devontae Adams, one of the best wide receivers in the NFL, available to you. Jacoby Myers was a pretty nice signing for them last offseason, was dealing with some concussion injuries, but when he was available, he was really good. Trey Tucker flashed some potential as well, and like I mentioned, you draft Brock Bowers after already last year taking Michael Mayer out of Notre Dame in the second round, that they might have one of the best tight end rooms in the NFL. And I think that Bowers and Mayer can give you a lot of positional flexibility as well in terms of being able to, I think that Bowers will be able to line up outside some, but both of them either way, you add just a couple big bodies into the room that I think that the overall weapons are pretty solid. Now, the offensive line has some questions. Colton Miller has become a really promising left tackle that I feel good about that there. And I did really like the draft pickup for them in Jackson Powers Johnson, who played center at Oregon. Now, on ESPN, he's currently listed as the potential starting right guard for them, so we'll see there. But just some unproven there, I would say, on the right side of their offensive line. So could be an average or slightly below average group out of the Raiders on the offensive line from a standpoint. But defensively, they add themselves a big-time hitter in Christian Wilkins, formerly with the Miami Dolphins. And Christian Wilkins, I think that he just does not get enough respect nationally for how much of a dominant player he is. From an interior, defensive lineman position, he's able to give you incredible run support, and this past year especially was able to flourish a little bit in terms of the pass rushing standpoint. A career high 9 sacks, and that's something that, paired up with Max Crosby himself, I think could be a lethal duo up front. But the defense was overall a pretty good performing group last year. You see the biggest concern with them is that run stop, so I am curious how much of a priority, and I'm curious almost if you were to go back and ask the Miami coaches last year if there was more of an emphasis to get Christian Wilkins looks on the pass rush as opposed to being the run stopper. But either way, he's going to be able to do whatever you ask of him, really. Paired with Max Crosby, I mean, things start to get scary there. I do think that they have some pretty good depth from the front line, specifically Malcolm Kuntz, an emerging player for them. Adam Butler, solid defensive tackle as well. If they were able to get any sort of breakout season from Tyree Wilson, who they drafted in the top 10 last year, and ultimately had a very disappointing season, that if he could emerge onto the scene for them as well, you're looking at a borderline elite pass rush overall. But it's when you look at the back half of their defense that is where you start to have some question marks. Robert Spillane had a really nice season from the middle linebacker position last year. Diablo was a fine player. But I look at that secondary as well. Jack Jones, somebody that has, whenever he's been available on the football field, he's been a very nice contributor, going back to when he was with the Patriots, and last year I think he switched over mid-season to the Raiders. But the issue is that personality, I don't know if personality, off the field antics would have gotten in his way a little bit. And the most recent example is bringing a gun to Logan Airport in Boston, which is a psychotic move. But at the same time, I mean, the kid can ball. So Jack Jones, if we see a 17 game sample size out of him and he's able to put up similar production, I mean, he could definitely put himself into some conversations in terms of young up and coming cornerbacks. I do like Trayvon Moehrig from the safety position as well. Just a very solid starter that's able to, hold down the scene a little bit for you. And I think that, there's some other names in there as well. Marcus Epps, Nate Hobbs. I don't want to, make them up to be any sort of a top tier secondary. It's definitely a group that has promise, but I think that is just the thing, is there's a lot of unproven. I think that in large part it's going to fall on Antonio Pierce to be able to make the most out of the situation. looking at their schedule for the upcoming year, they are on the more difficult end. It is the 9th hardest schedule according to Sharp Football Analysis. I look especially early on here. I mean, I think they have a pretty difficult schedule overall. Now, also playing the NFC South, so you got a couple games in there, such as the Panthers at home, that you can feel good about. But even still, a lot of those South matchups are on the road at Tampa Bay, in New Orleans. And I think that ultimately, when you look at this set schedule for the Raiders, there just aren't too many, given wins. And I understand the Raiders do consistently outperform expectations, and I'm really rooting for Antonio Pierce, but I think when you look at the quarterbacks they're going to be facing this year and just the way this is all going to shake out, I don't feel great about the Raiders overall. Now, again, they always outperform expectations. I'm sure there are a couple games that you can look in there, maybe some difficult-ish rosters, and you look at the LA Rams, the Jacksonville Jaguars, those types of games that I do look at. You throw the Saints in there as well, or the Buccaneers, of teams that could, you feel like on paper the Raiders should maybe lose to, that they could possibly end up surprising, but I do have the Raiders as a 5-win team this year. Anthony comments, in your honest opinion, do you feel that Antonio Pierce is possibly a lame duck coaching-wise? They're going to fire him if it doesn't work? Well, that's the thing. I think they win 5 games this year, and if you look at specifically that quarterback position, it is just sort of not filled between Gardner Minshew and Aiden O'Connell. I feel like if you injected that front office with truth serum, they would prefer to have some sort of another option to lean on. I don't think that either one of them are going to be the starter come 2025, but you do look at the schedule again. I especially worry about Antonio Pierce in that first stretch of the season, where outside of week 3 at home against the Panthers, I think that's a pretty difficult schedule overall. And it's going to take some of those, middling teams on the road against Denver, at home against Pittsburgh. And again, I mentioned, Rams probably a little bit higher up on the totem pole there, but on the road against the Rams, like, those are games that I think Antonio Pierce is going to need to be able to, show that, no, he's not some incredible offensive mastermind or anything, but as a motivator, he is able to coach up a team to be able to come away with those 50-50 games. Anthony says, do you feel that it's unfair to these coaches that might be a bridge coach, that they're stuck with a rebuilding scenario and they can't really do anything they want? I mean, to that, I would say you look at, who was it? Lovie Smith, when he was with the Texans. The Texans, for a while there, were just sort of a revolving door, and I thought that that was completely unfair at the time. And it's a tough situation to be in, because those things can sort of, weigh on your overall reputation if you do have a bad year. But I would like to think that, especially after the Raiders tried to go out and poach a top offensive mind in Josh McDaniels and see just how flat that fell because of the personality standpoint, that I think Antonio Pierce does have a legitimate chance. Now, again, it is probably not the top end in terms of job security, that I don't necessarily feel great for him in that sense, but I do think that he could make it out. Anthony says the Chicago Bears, another good example of they fired their coach that won them the Super Bowl. They have been having a revolving door for the past 2 decades. I mean, I think for the Bears as well, it's the coaching situation. I think John Fox was the one that seemed like that was the one that I thought was going to work out for him after he was fired from Denver. But I think the Bears also have sort of had a talent problem as well. So I'm definitely with you in terms of, yes, the Bears have definitely been a revolving door. Matt Nagy as well, winning the Coach of the Year for them, only to be fired. I think it was 2 years later. But it also comes down to, the roster building there, and I do think that Ryan Poles has put an incredible group there together in Chicago. So for Pierce, again, I think that I'm hoping he has like a 2-year leash here, as long as things aren't absolutely terrible and as long as the locker room is still on board. The Raiders are just sort of looking for an identity, and Antonio Pierce just might be the guy that, while the entire NFL seems to be moving on to, these offensive specialists, that sometimes a hard-nosed coach is able to just be enough for you. Anthony says, can't stand the owner in Miami. He has to be cheap for a coach because he doesn't want to give full control out to anybody. I mean, that's definitely part of it as well, which is why I think in this Antonio Pierce situation, he's not looking for really any amount of power. He's just looking to, make a name for himself and inspire this group. So looking at how I have the Raiders lined up with the other teams that we've previewed so far, again, I think that the Raiders could definitely end up winning a bunch of extra games, and if they do, it's going to be because Antonio Pierce, again, in that locker room and just buying in there. But I think the quarterback, the handicap at the quarterback position is going to be really tough for them to overcome. But definitely let me know in the comments section who you would expect to be the difference maker for the Raiders if they are to rattle off some more wins than expected. They're currently sitting at 6.5 wins per Vegas. But again, let me know on that front. With last night's game, we are just around the corner from NFL football, though, full time here. And I just want to go through and list off some of the storylines I'm looking forward to seeing play out the most and what my expectations are. So stick with us, and we will be right back after this quick break. Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast for our final segment of the day. And considering we are just coming off of the Hall of Fame game and really scratching at that itch for football, I want to talk about the things I'm most excited to watch play out this season. And the first one that comes to mind for me is I am just so fascinated about the hierarchy of quarterbacks in the AFC. We've seen for the past few years, we have all of these up-and-coming stars. It was Patrick Mahomes' sort of league for the taking, and then we saw the Josh Allens and the Joe Burrows start to rival their way into the conversation. Lamar Jackson hasn't necessarily had that postseason moment yet that we've been waiting on, but I'm someone that really believes in Lamar in terms of him eventually going to be able to break through. So he's in that conversation as well. CJ Stroud emerges onto the scene with an all-time rookie season last year. So it's something that I'm always sort of watching for. And, I just talked about Justin Herbert as well earlier in the show. It seemed like he maybe had a flash in the pan in terms of being put into those conversations. Now, injuries have derailed that, and overall just the lack of stability there in LA in terms of the job that their front office has done for putting talent around him. But I think that there is just such a constant evolving of these conversations, and the AFC in general is just so loaded at the top there that in terms of quarterback talent, that I think that ultimately NFL fans are never just going to fully sit back and enjoy things, that they're never going to be willing to acknowledge that every one of them is great. But I do like sort of monitoring the way that we see these guys matched up against one another. I mean, of course, Mahomes is in a league of his own pretty much, but that who is going to be his, the Peyton Manning to him being Tom Brady, that has been sort of the dialogue over the past couple seasons. And it might just be that Mahomes has more than one rival, that he has, a number of different quarterbacks sort of itching to take the throne from him. But I mean, the way it's been up to this point, I wouldn't say he has his one nemesis yet. So that's really what I'm getting at here, is I wonder if that we are going to see somebody really snatch that. Again, it's kind of lame talking about snatching the number 2 spot, but I do think that would kind of mean a lot, because right now we are sort of in the Patrick Mahomes era, not to, gas him up too much necessarily, but it's hard to deny that when he's won, 3 Super Bowls, and he's started for 7 seasons, something along those lines. So, Mahomes is a crazy talent, and I do just sort of want to see, if we end up getting some sort of all-time quarterback rivalry that comes out of this era that we're currently living in, with a ton of quarterback talent stacked up in one conference. That being said, I'm also looking at the NFC side and seeing it. I want to see whether or not we do see the, true emergence of any one of those quarterbacks sort of take the reins, because additionally, we spend so much time talking about the AFC quarterbacks that, I think very clearly the top 4 quarterbacks in the league are in that AFC. If you're going Mahomes, Burrow, Allen, and Lamar. And then still you probably lean towards the AFC. Now, we have maybe some potential candidates there. Jordan Love has been getting a ton of flowers over the course of this offseason, and people are really buying in there. And I'm on board with him too, for sure, but I would probably like to see a little bit more of that elite ceiling, which is definitely still a possibility. He was tremendous down the stretch of the second half of the season, but, this was an interesting point that I heard on the Ringer NFL show a few days ago about if Jordan Love had his season sort of played in reverse, and he was playing really good football at the beginning and the rough patch was towards the end, he would not have gotten that $220 million contract probably. And obviously that's unfair. The idea is that you are supposed to progress with time, but I'm just saying that's kind of the margin that we're looking at here, is we are analyzing him entirely off of one season for the most part. Obviously there were people that were high on him when he was coming out of Utah State. I gotta be honest, I don't know how much film I've really crunched on a Utah State Jordan Love from 2019, 2020, but again, I'm saying all this and that's on me 100%, but Jordan Love, I still believe in him, and I think that he can be, one of the best quarterbacks in the NFC easily, but is he going to be seen as one of the best quarterbacks in the NFL? I do still think that there's another level to go there, which is to be expected considering the fact that he has had just one season's worth of playing experience so far, despite the fact he's been in the league for the past few years, but I do sort of think that Caleb Williams has a golden opportunity to jumpstart his way into that conversation in terms of best quarterbacks in the NFC, because the top you have right now, it's Dak Prescott and it's Jalen Hurts, and both of them are definitely viewed as flawed to some degree. I think that I like Dak Prescott more than the average fan. I'm comfortable saying he's a very good quarterback, probably somewhere around that 7th, 8th spot, but inside of the top 10 sort of comfortably, I would say. Jalen Hurts is in that conversation as well. I feel like I did a quarterback ranking video a couple weeks ago, and I did sort of come away with it feeling bad that I wasn't higher on Jalen Hurts, but I'm also, I don't think that he has the true superstar best quarterback in the league potential necessarily. So it's kind of hard to balance there. And then Brock Purdy is the other name that obviously garners a lot of attention, considering the fact that he is the quarterback that everybody is sort of just waiting to we're just waiting to see him fail, even though he has not done so over the course of the past couple seasons, and that when he's played, he's been massively successful for the 49ers. Now, obviously, in a Shanahan offense with the best supporting cast that any 7th-round pick possibly could have ever dreamed of walking into. And, what that looks like from here is sort of, a big deal for sure. And then I also feel like, just in terms of storylines for this upcoming season, there are a couple coaching situations that I'm really interested in. We just covered the Broncos season preview a couple days ago. Definitely be sure to check that out if you missed it. But Sean Payton, I think that this isn't necessarily a make or break year for him. This is a transition year, but with considering Bo Nix is likely going to be their starting quarterback, it's, not a ton of people I think are super high on Bo Nix, even though supposedly Sean Payton is. But just seeing the vision of the Broncos, seeing how that plays out, I think is going to be very important for the overall legacy of Sean Payton. We talked about Antonio Pierce enough earlier in the show, and whether or not he is able to sort of fend off being a lame duck coach that's just sort of sitting on the sidelines until the Raiders organization sees a bigger fish and they can, invest themselves into it. Seems like he has the locker room, but, some degree. And I'm not even going to go there. Just the idea of, how far can the power of friendship really push you? And Antonio Pierce is, obviously far more technically sound than that. But when you look at the Raiders being successful this year, I think that it's going to be, again, the locker room being invested and taking some overachieving players. And it doesn't happen without good coaching. So it's going to be a nice sort of establishing point for Antonio Pierce. And then, obviously, Mike McCarthy as well. And what goes on there in Dallas, and just the overall Dallas kind of circus show that has been taking place over the course of the past couple seasons, how this all seems to shake out financially. Going to be so many questions about Dak Prescott and CeeDee Lamb and Micah Parsons that, I'm sure you've heard enough of over the course of this past offseason, but is something that is still going to be very interesting to tune into. But that is all the time we have for today. Thank you very much for tuning into the GSMC Sports Podcast. Thank you to the GSMC Sports Network for allowing us to host this show. Remember to like, follow, subscribe wherever you keep up with us. Be sure to check us out on social media as well for more exclusive short content. And we will be back on Monday, same time as always, 2:00 p.m. Eastern. We will see you then. Take care. Have a great weekend.
Let's go. I wake up to a little bit of drool on my pillow, feel like it's gonna be a bad day. Yeah, I'm tired of shit, and the coffee ain't hit yet. Damn, ain't that great.